Welcome to our shorter catechism, Revo. We've just finished looking at the offices that Jesus Christ plays as our Redeemer, the offices of prophet, priest, and king. And now what we're going to do is summarize the work and the ministry of Jesus Christ. And the categories that we're going to use to summarize his ministry is the humiliation and the exaltation of Jesus Christ. So today it'll be question 27 on the humiliation of Christ, and then next time it'll be question 28 on the exaltation. So let's look at question 27. What did Christ's humiliation consist of? Christ's humiliation consisted of his being born, and that in a low condition, made under the law, undergoing the miseries of this life, the wrath of God, and the cursed death of the cross, in being buried and continuing under the power of death for a time. So when we think about the word humiliation, typically we use that to say I feel humiliated, I feel embarrassed because something happened. That's certainly a part of humiliation, but in a broader sense, humiliation it means to be brought low. It means to be humbled. And for us to say that Christ was in a state of humiliation it assumes that he was in a high place. He was in a high place and then he was brought low. And this is what this catechism question is trying to show. All the steps that were involved in the humiliation, in the humbling, in the bringing low of Jesus Christ, who was and always is the eternal Son of God. So he's fully God. So his humiliation consisted of these many steps. And then, of course, when we get to the exaltation, we're going to take those steps back up to see how he went all the way back to the right hand of God. So let's look at these steps. First, the catechism question says he was born of a human. Which of all the steps, that's the biggest step. That's like the biggest humiliation that he had to undergo, because we're talking about what we call an ontological jump. God, who is of one nature, became another nature, became human. And so this is something we've looked at in the person of Jesus Christ, this God becoming human, God taking on flesh. And does this mean that he lost some of his divinity, that he had to put aside his godness? The text that we look at here is Philippians chapter 2, where in verse 7, it speaks of Jesus emptying himself. The Greek word keno, which means emptied. And so we look at that, and some people take that to mean that Jesus, who was God, at some point put aside his godness and then put on the humanity. He emptied himself. That's not what emptied means. Emptied means to be putting on a position of loneliness. And so in this case, what Jesus did was added humanity to himself. It was a subtraction by addition. By putting on human flesh and human experience, he was lowering himself. Think about it this way. There's this old cartoon called Naruto. And in this cartoon, there's a character named Rock Lee who's a fighter. And he's training against other fighters. And as he's fighting this other guy, he's doing a pretty good job, but he's not able to get past this other guy's defenses. And so the fight goes on and people are commenting, Rock Lee's never going to be able to do this. And then at one dramatic moment, Rock Lee's teacher calls out to him and says, "Okay, Rock, now's the time that you could do it." And Rock Lee's like, "Are you sure that I'm able to?" And the teacher says, "Yes." And then Rock Lee reveals that he's actually been carrying these humongous weights on his legs that he wears to help him train. And so by taking these weights off, he's able to now show his full strength, his full speed, and penetrate the defenses of this other guy. That's sort of like the emptying of Jesus Christ. He came down and he put on flesh that in many ways limited him and restricted him, not while putting off any of his divinity. So let's continue down the steps. The next step, he was born in a low condition, which means that when he came to earth, he didn't come and was born into like a royal family where he was a prince and a king, although he was the son of David, but he was born in a very humble circumstance and surroundings. We remember the Christmas story. He was born in a manger. He was born to Virgin Mary and Joseph. So he was born in a low condition, and then the next step, he was made under the law. So the law, God's law, the law that was given to man in order for man to recognize how holy God was. God himself came and made himself subject to this very law. So that's what we mean when we say he was made under law. Next step, he was undergoing the miseries of this life, meaning that as he emptied himself and took on flesh, he put on our experience. He experienced our pain, our sufferings, our fears, our hurts, our miseries, the pain that we feel when others hurt us, the pain that we feel when things happen to our loved ones. He put all this on. He underwent all of the miseries that we go through. This is why Hebrews chapter 4 talks about Jesus as this great high priest who's able to understand our weaknesses. He was even tempted. The difference, of course, is that he didn't actually give into temptation, but he was even tempted, so he understands what it means to be going through these trials that we go through. The next step, he was made under the wrath of God. We look at the cross. We look at what happened there. And it was the wrath of the Father against sin fully poured out on the Son. This is the Son who only knew perfect fellowship with the Father. When he felt this wrath at the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's feeling the fullness of God's wrath against sin. And so that's why the next step, it's called the cursed death of the cross. This was a curse. This was a covenantal curse. Those who break the covenant that we talked about earlier with God entering into covenant with Adam, those who break the covenant would be cursed, and this was exactly the curse that Jesus was taking upon himself when he went and died at the cross. And then finally he was buried. He was actually dead. The Catechism says that he was under the power of death for a time. And so that's the last step that we stop at, the humiliation of Jesus Christ. That's the length that God descended in order to show us his love for us and his faithfulness to us. And what our Lord is doing is calling us as Christians, as Christ followers, as disciples. He's calling us to follow the same path. He's calling us into a life of humility, humiliation. In the Christian life, in the kingdom life, humility is the path to greatness. The first to be last, and the last will be first. And so that's what we move with as we consider the humiliation of Jesus Christ. Are we willing to follow him in this life of humility? And we do that when we serve others, when we put the needs of others before our own. Humility is tricky because it's hard to practice humility. When you try to be humble, you find that you're doing the exact opposite of that. You're drawing attention to yourself. And so practicing humility can be a tricky thing. But a good way, a good place to start, if you want to be humble, is think about the humility of Jesus Christ. Walk yourself down the steps of Christ's humiliation. Walk down it slowly. Think about it. And as you do that, ask the Lord to make you of the same heart, the same demeanor.